Early on the morning of March 4th, 1944, mechanics at Steeple Morden Airfield in Cambridgeshire were finishing the installation of two teardrop-shaped metal tanks beneath the wings of a fighter the Royal Air Force had turned down for high-altitude work 18 months before. The aircraft was the P-51 Mustang. Each tank held 108 gallons of aviation fuel, pressed from cheap steel and intended to be thrown away after use. Pilots griped that they wrecked the plane's silhouette. That same morning, American fighters escorted heavy bombers to Berlin and back for the first time in the entire war, a round trip pushing 1,600 miles. German fighter controllers who had spent 2 years banking on the assumption that Allied escort aircraft simply couldn't cross the German border watched Mustangs circling over the Reich capital. On paper, bolting external tanks to a fighter should have produced a sluggish compromise. In practice, those cheap steel canisters were about to tear apart the logic that held German air defense together. Standard fighter doctrine on both sides of the Atlantic treated range and performance as a fixed trade. More fuel meant more weight and more drag. A fighter that turned badly, climbed slowly, and lost to any clean interceptor willing to press the engagement. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109 and Fw-190 were both built around that assumption. Short legs, minimal fuel load, peak agility, because the air war they planned for was fought directly over German-held ground. British Spitfires operated the same way for the same reason. Fighter aircraft were intentionally short-ranged because no one had cracked how to extend endurance without destroying the handling qualities that kept a pilot alive in a turning fight. Analysts who looked at early Mustang proposals involving drop tanks spelled the objection out plainly. Add 2 tanks under those wings, and you've produced an overweight fuel hauler that any competent 109 driver will knock down. The physics behind that argument were sound. What it missed was what actually determined the outcome of air battles in 1944. The tanks alone weren't the answer. What mattered was the airframe they were attached to. North American Aviation's 1940 design used a laminar flow wing, a profile shaped to keep airflow attached across the upper surface much farther toward the trailing edge than a conventional wing could manage, which cut cruise drag significantly. The early Mustangs were held back by the Allison V1710 engine, which bled power badly above 15,000 feet because it lacked the supercharger stages needed for high-altitude work. British engineers at Rolls-Royce looked at the airframe and recognized what they had. In 1942, they dropped in a Merlin 61 with a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger, which Packard built under license in the States as the V1657. The result was a different aircraft. Top speed at altitude broke past 440 miles per hour. The fuel arithmetic then did the rest. An internal tank of 75 gallons behind the cockpit, backed by 2 external tanks of 75 or later 108 gallons apiece, gave the Mustang a combat radius approaching 850 miles. Berlin, Munich, Poland, the Mustang could reach them and fight there, not just transit the airspace and turn back. German pilots expected to work around the drop tank problem the way they'd worked around everything else. Standard interception procedure assumed Allied escort fighters would stay welded to the bombers they were covering, flying at the formation's pace, predictable and reactive, reachable by a fast-diving attack before they could accelerate into a response. That tactic had paid off. Through 1943, B-17s and B-24s pressing deep into the Reich without fighter cover had taken losses that raised real doubts about the bomber offensive sustainability. On the second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943, 60 aircraft out of 291 dispatched failed to come home, a rate the 8th Air Force couldn't absorb much longer. German Fighter Command expected the situation on March 4th, 1944, to follow the same pattern, just over a longer approach route. Instead, they ran into a fighter force that had stopped flying defensively entirely. The second, less visible part of what changed was doctrinal rather than mechanical. When Major General Jimmy Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force's fighter operations in January 1944, he scrapped the standing requirement that fighter groups shadow the bomber formations and wait to be attacked. His new standing order was short. Leave the bombers, go find the German fighters and destroy them before they reach the formation. including on the way home, over their own airfields. Matched with the radius the drop tanks made possible, this sent groups like the 4th, 355th, and 357th out in front of the bomber stream, engaging Luftwaffe fighters as they climbed to altitude, and then hitting German airfields on the return leg when fuel margins allowed. These units weren't escorting in any traditional sense. They were hunting. The results appeared quickly. During Big Week, February 20th through 25th, 1944, and through the March Berlin raids that followed, the Luftwaffe's fighter force took the kind of losses it had never absorbed before. Across March 1944 alone, historians estimate the Luftwaffe lost roughly 56% of its fighter pilot strength on the Western Front, with the attrition rate running around 20% monthly through the rest of the spring, a pace no training program in existence could replace fast enough. General Adolf Galland, who ran Luftwaffe fighter operations, reportedly said that seeing Mustangs over Berlin told him the war was over, because it meant American engineers had solved a range limitation German planners had counted on as a permanent ceiling. Whether the specific phrasing is exact hardly matters. The operational reports coming up the German chain of command said the same thing in their own language. The experienced pilots, veterans of the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, North Africa, were dying in an air war being fought 1,000 miles inside where anyone had expected the front to reach. None of this was the result of a single clever fix. It was built from several unglamorous decisions that only added up together. The laminar flow wing kept parasitic drag low enough that strapping on 2 external tanks didn't degrade performance the way the same modification would have ruined a heavier airframe. The Merlin gave the plane the altitude performance to stay competitive in a turning fight even when loaded. And the tanks themselves were designed from the start for one-way use. When combat began, the pilot hit a release, the tanks fell clear, and within seconds the Mustang was back at its clean fighting weight. A German pilot who set up an attack, expecting to close on a slow, fuel-heavy target would find, after the drop, a Mustang that had shed 200-plus pounds of steel in under 10 seconds and was turning with him on even terms. Ground crews who logged fuel states on Mustangs returning from Berlin missions regularly recorded aircraft landing on 20 to 30 gallons remaining. The entire mission, tanks included, had been planned around margins that thin, and it held together because every other element of the aircraft had been refined to avoid burning a single unnecessary gallon. Critics were correct that the drop tanks left the Mustang exposed during the outbound leg. German controllers who understood this tried to position interceptions for that window, catching fighter groups still carrying external fuel over the North Sea or the Dutch coast before they could drop and fight clean. But that approach surfaced a deeper problem in German assumptions more than a real flaw in American planning. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe didn't have enough fighters, pilots, or aviation fuel left to reliably threaten that window with any consistency. Standing patrol patterns drained precious gasoline that Germany could no longer produce in volume after Allied bombers began hitting synthetic fuel facilities at Luna and Politz from May 1944 onward, raids that had only become possible in the first place because the Mustang's range let the bombers reach that far into the Reich. The tanks had set off a chain reaction. Greater escort range let bombers strike fuel production. Striking fuel production reduced German capacity to train replacement pilots and fly enough sorties to endanger American bombers. Reduced German sorties let American fighters operate even more freely. By summer 1944, Mustang pilots weren't thinking about drop tanks as a trade-off anymore. They were the prerequisite. Pilots of the 357 Fighter Group at Leiston described taking off so heavy with fuel that the aircraft barely cleared the hedgerows at the runway's end, then finding themselves over Munich 4 hours later with the tanks long since shed into a field somewhere in Germany below. Victory ratios told the numerical version of the story. American fighter groups flying long-range escort through 1944 recorded kill ratios against German opponents that in some units climbed past 5-1, a figure that would have been incomprehensible in 1943 when American fighters couldn't get to the fight at all. That didn't come from some aerodynamic breakthrough the engineers had been hiding. It came from solving a logistics question: how to carry fuel without turning the aircraft carrying it into a liability, and then using that answer aggressively rather than defensively the moment it became available. Doolittle wasn't being careless when he sent fighters to hunt instead of babysit. He understood that air superiority wasn't gained by keeping formation with the aircraft you were assigned to protect. It was gained by destroying the enemy's ability to threaten those aircraft in the first place. Wars don't get settled by which piece of hardware scores best in an engineering review or against a test specification. They get settled by which combination of engineering and command decision holds up when the opponent is adapting at the same time. The pressed steel drop tank, abandoned in the thousands over German farmland, never made it to a museum winged the way the Mustang's airframe did. But without it, the fighter everyone calls the best of the war would have stayed exactly what British test pilots concluded in 1942, a brilliant aircraft with no way to go anywhere far enough to matter. The real trick wasn't the tank itself. It was designing an aircraft lean enough that bolting two cheap steel drums under its wings didn't break what made it dangerous, and then flying that combination over Berlin at the exact moment every prior assumption said the mission couldn't be flown at all.